Your work deals with subjects that are often seen as taboo. How has the response been?
It's interesting. This project actually started in 2010 when I decided to do a pilot study in Kodambakkam. So at that point of time, it was just like trying to find who were the people who were making these films because no one knows anything about the filmmakers because they were anonymous. They used fictitious names. From 2010, doing the pilot to 2024 when the book came out. It's been more than 14 years. So the project changed a lot. And, in terms of the stakes I have in intervening in labor studies, understanding precarious labor practices, and also understanding what embodied labor means for many of these actresses, it took me into a rabbit hole, I should say, because, start a project, you are trying to understand what this project would mean for South Asian cinema. But then you understand it's not just about South Asian cinema, it's about media flows. It's about understanding the way in which region is connected to transnational. So I think, it has been like a really good journey so far. The book has been received very differently among different quarters. I think, like it has been reviewed by popular press. And like you said, I think people were interested in understanding why an academic would be interested in doing, work, 15 plus years of work on a taboo topic. And some others were like also asking about the kind of pressures, challenges that I faced, and which was kind of substantial as well, I should say, as a female ethnographer working on adult media in a conservative society as an insider. I should say that because insider outsider dichotomy also creates this idea of who gets access and like what are the conditions of possibility under which works could be done. We can get into it in a conversation, but um,
Yeah.
and again, like some from some conservative quarters, there was pushback as well. Men's rights group were like up in arms, and some of the
Oh,
some
wow.
was Zoom bombed by men's rights group who wanted to reclaim their voice and agency, which they thought they lost through my work because it's about female sexual pleasure. So it's interesting that in this current political climate, it becomes much more balanced to talk about what does it mean to do feminist work in South Asia.
Yeah. Yeah. So your book opens up with a deep personal reflection on growing up in Kerala. And Kerala is such a beautiful place, but you also describe it as a place with sort of progressive social indicators, high literacy, leftist politics, but also deeply entrenched in gendered norms, right? Gendered and casteist norms. How did this contradiction shape your understanding of sexuality in media?
The myth around the Kerala model development has been something that fascinated me when I started researching on how gender and sexuality and norms kind of mediate a certain expectation of ideal femininity. And there has been like brilliant scholarship based on Kerala by scholars like J. Devika, Navanita Mukil, G. Arunima, and others, looking at the way in which the matrilineal past of some of the communities also creates certain expectations on what does it mean to have this progressive liberatory space where the social indices are all really high. And you would expect that, with literacy, high rates of literacy, women have equal stakes in the way in which, conversations take shape in public sphere, which unfortunately was not the case. I think the root realization for any scholar working in Kerala is that, the contradiction is where, you are able to understand the nuances around like gender, caste, class, and different matrices of intersectionality, which creates new ways in which different groups can enter and exit and not on equal terms at all, like whose voices get heard and who are these people pitched in the kind of rational deliberative public sphere. That was something which really really interested me because the idea of media publics that I'm pitching in the book emerged from that, the kind of contradictoriness, the messiness. And I wanted to understand the kind of problematics within which women and also like empowered women, both sexually and who wanted to create their own kind of autonomous space, or women who are career oriented, they wanted to really think about upward social mobility in a different terms. How are these women being portrayed in public space, and the kind of expectations that are put upon them? So caste becomes like a very important vector. I still remember that when I was growing up, this was late 90s, early 2000s, I still remember that there was this suicide by a Dalit scholar. I think, she was a college student and she couldn't pay the fee and she was kind of bullied and she committed suicide. And the media reports on that suicide was very strange. I still remember that, some of the reports were also speculating on the kind of like sandals she were wearing, and saying that how did she get money to buy the sandals. So it became like pinned down on speculating, creating this idea of gossip and rumor and fragmentary information circulated, creating kind of thicket of information, so much information, so that you can spin stories around it, which might have nothing to do with the factual claims. So this kind of constant attack on women coming from caste oppressed communities, and for that matter, like how women in general are attacked in public, it created a certain kind of normalcy around what does it mean to appear as an idealized Malayali woman who will be embraced by the society as like someone who could be accommodated into the bourgeois middle class family norms. So my work has been to rethink what is family, what does it mean to create certain cultural expectations around this is how you would fit in within the heteronormative matrix. And
Yeah.
soft porn films were fascinating for me on two counts. One was because it was all about heterosexual man's fascination for certain bodies, certain women, certain desires. But again, these films also had like a kind of an unsettling quality. They were all centered around strong female characters, whom in the book I call Madhaka Rani, who were all driven by this desire to bypass the class caste constraints and go for upward social mobility. They might have used their body as like a vehicle, as a weapon for this social mobility. But I was fascinated by the desire for them to create and chart out a way where they are negotiating with patriarchy for upward social mobility. So I don't call Madhaka Rani as a feminist figure. I would say that Madhaka Rani uses the patriarchal logic by understanding that you will negotiate with patriarchy because you cannot completely get away from patriarchy. It's so enwrapped in the way we think, the way institutional structures are formulated, that a woman who is outside the idea of a kind of a heterosexual family model will be the one who will be able to understand how to unsettle the idealized understanding of femininity. So that woman became important for me. And from my conversation with many queer, community members, they all said that they were fascinated by this figure of Madhaka Rani, not because of the heterosexual kind of underpinnings of the desire that many men were fascinated by, but they thought that by being the bad woman, she can actually go to the extreme of badness, right? Like you don't have to be an ideal woman anymore. You're anyway being cast aside as someone who did not fit into the familial norms of heterosexual, middle class norms. And so that gave that woman the power to actually recast and rethink what it means to actually exist in this society with this contradictory social norms at place.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in your field work, you conducted interviews with technicians, body doubles, and distributors and actresses. What were some of the biggest challenges in researching a subject that carries such stigma?
So when I started this project, the only work that was available, like looking soft porn in a academic kind of way, like as a research intervention, was Pradesh Radhakrishnan's 2010 work, Soft Porn Anxieties and Family. And that was a trigger for me to understand what else can we know about a form which is basically written about in a very sensational way as exploitative practice, as something that is kind of promoting a certain kind of casting couch. So there is only like stories which were looking at soft porn industry as a hub of vice that I could locate. But I actually thought that there is a labor involved. There are people making these films. We might not know them. And sometimes journalists might not have access, and like whatever knowledge you might know of the industry is also mediated via different sources. So I wanted to actually understand who were behind the making of the film. So I went to Kodambakkam and stayed there for a long time. So the idea of cinematic wait time I write in chapter 3 is also part of the waiting for people to speak. Because unlike a project where you have a data set you work with or you know exactly whom to speak, for a project like this, it's also the willingness of the people to get back in touch with you once they know you are looking for them. That was important for me. And I think the question of ethics is so important, especially when you are doing a project which is about other people's failure, other people's misery, the way in which they were cast aside, how their careers were destroyed. So I think I was very cognizant of the fact that this is not like any other project where you can finish your PhD and move on. It's a project where you are trying to figure out alongside your respondents what happened, what could have happened differently. So I think that kind of connection was something I was consistently trying to build, and a lot of people, and especially like in an industry which is informal, it takes a lot of time for people to trust you. So I also had to like work in the industry, like take odd jobs, once as a dubbing artist, then as a production assistant. So they all knew that I was there not to get the data and move on, but also like trying to understand how the industry worked. And I think that
Mhm.
experience really, really helped me, because it's first of all, it's a very humbling experience to also know that it's not about armchair intellectualism where you sit there and write, but it's also to understand the contingencies, the kind of anxieties, insecurities, vulnerabilities my respondents went through. And as a researcher, I am going through, because there was a point of time when, I was waiting in Kodambakkam and nothing really happened other than me going to the film labs, waiting with, people who were waiting for jobs, whom I, in my book, refer to as film hopefuls, who come
Yeah.
from different, acting schools. So it was a very interesting experience to see how this unpacks. So in the book, I actually talk about different scales of labor practices. That sometimes
Yeah.
when you talk about film labor or cinema laborer or cinema worker, we are not just talking about above the line, below the line distinction. Even though these phrases are emerging from the global north context, we need to understand that there are different scales of practices. Above the line would involve creative decision making, where you have director, cinematographer, the main cast. All of them are paid outright, like the amount they negotiate with the producer, as opposed to the below the line labor, some of whom have to be paid daily wages. Some others, it's also about like, a contract, but again, they will be paid at the end of the shift. So it's interesting to understand what does it mean to procure labor. And I call this practice, is prevalent in many industries at the time, as proximate networks, where
Mhm.
everyone feels that they have to be closer to people who have power and creative making, basically socialize in the same circle and, be part of their team so
Mhm.
that you are able to procure work. And so
Yeah.
that kind of expectations is also creating this kind of clique mentality where, most of the men kind of, expect that the production manager or production executive is the person, the go-to person, and to who will be able to give work, but who will also be able to connect you to other set of people who are, wielding more power. So power is out there in the way jobs are given, promises and assurance are given. And for me, it was important to understand what makes people move to a place like Kodambakkam, or for that matter, Bombay, wait for this hope that something will turn up at some point of time. So when I spoke with many of my respondents, there was this person who was running
Yeah.
a tea shop, who came
Mhm.
in the 1980s to be a actor. That didn't work out, and he ended up, be running a tea shop first as an assistant to a tea vendor, and then he started one of his own after like 7 or 8 years. So it's interesting that people kind of migrate to different occupations, primarily because everyone is trying to do the idea of make do arrangements to survive. And that became one of the ways I was looking at soft porn. Soft porn not as an industry which is morally corrupt, because that's easy to make an argument. It's morally corrupt, there is sex, and you move on. But what
Yeah.
else is happening there was something that really, really, fascinated me when I started to have conversations with people. And that's where, speaking with people, and many of these people were also like very generous with sharing the material. So for
Yeah.
a project like this, you cannot go to state institutions like National Film Archive of India to look at
Yeah.
the fingerprints, because these are not even legitimate material of study for state institutions.
Yeah.
So what I relied on for this project are material from personal collectors, scrap dealers, and some of the film personnel who used to collect materials of the films that they participated in. So I think it's like my project was also trying to move out of pure methodology of doing film studies by trying to do what I call impure methods. I'm
Mhm.
happy to talk more about it, but it was important for me to
Yeah.
say why I did what I did. And impure method became one way of understanding why qualitative research methodologies could work with archival research and ethnographic research and participant observation in order to triangulate the data, especially because nothing else has been written on soft porn. So when you become the first person to basically do an industry study of a form that has been seen as of degraded aesthetics and not of like important in terms of form and content, there is an additional responsibility invested in you, and that's where the ethics of the researcher becomes important.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, I'm just gonna transition into just return back to the the Madhaka Rani sort of figure. And you write, the figure of the Madhaka Rani, the hyper visible siren, became a symbol of transgressive desire, but also of caste coded anxieties about female sexuality. And Dalit feminist scholars argue that desire in South Asia is structured by caste. Did you see this play out in your own research
Yeah,
on?
totally.
Mhm,
Yeah, I think, that's an important kind of distinction one need to make between what becomes desirable and how is, the idea of consumption of certain bodies and certain desires and fantasies centered around the intersectional identities of, caste and class. And especially women who come from caste oppressed background, their bodies were seen as accessible or,
mhm,
visible, hyper visible, so much so that their agency, their desires, or, who they are completely in the background. Shailaja Paik has lit fantastic work where she's actually looking at this idea of respectability, right? Like when you are writing about lower caste women and desire, and she's talking in the context of tamasha, and she talks about this idea of like dignity. How do you talk about dignity even when you are, performing a kind of a cultural performance like tamasha? And that's where, the question of respectability came over and over again, because I do not want it to see like the figure of Madhaka Rani is devoid of caste or class, or the
mhm,
idea of like what kind of bodies are allowed to circulate very freely in this kind of a informal film circuit. So many of these women who came to Kodambakkam in the 1980s came from caste oppressed communities, but there were also women who came from upper caste, upper caste background, not necessarily upper class, who were all like driven by they
mhm,
wanted to become actresses, and they left their families. Many of them eloped with their people. Like some of them came together, like in two, three women from a village decided to come to Kodambakkam, wanting to explore what does it mean to basically, seek out for work and employment. So there is this idea of cinephilia sometimes that we do not think of when we speak
mhm.
about actresses or
Yeah.
actors wanting to, come to this place, a hub of dreams, whether it's like Hollywood or for that matter, Bollywood or Kodambakkam. So for me, it was important to like first make this distinction that the caste cannot be a question that is like added at a later point of time. Caste
Mhm.
is always already there, but we do not see it. And the
Yeah.
example that I've used in the book is Silk Smitha. Like Silk
Mhm.
Smitha, her death, the way in which the sensational reportage around it, some of which is not in the book, but it's going to come out as a separate piece because not everything could go there.
Yeah.
Uh, but Silk
Can you
Smitha's
explain, give a brief context of who this figure is and why she's important to your work?
Yeah, thank you, Cher. So, in the first chapter, when I'm describing Madhaka Rani and using Madhaka Rani as an analytical category, I am using the case study of three actresses, Silk Smitha, Rani Padmini, and Vijayashree. All of them had like their deaths and obituaries written about by film journalists. So, Rani Padmini and her mother were murdered. Vijayashree committed suicide, and it was also seen as a murder because by the time she committed suicide or by the time of her death, she was having like a huge legal battle with one of the prominent studios, Udaya Studio, at that point of time, and which
Hmm.
was all centered around a kind of a wardrobe malfunction that was caught during the film shoot, which she didn't
Hmm.
know of, but which she knew at later point of time was included in the film or circulated informally. So she basically started to question the studio, telling that you should have asked my permission. And then the studio kind of like said that you have always been cast in these roles, you never had any issues about it. And it became like this kind of tug of war between a woman wanting to reclaim her image, saying that, I have acted in these roles doesn't mean that I'm okay with these things. So the idea of consent and all of this became very, very interesting ideas to think about, like what becomes Malayalam film industry's kind of questions around gender safety, which comes in 2024 when Hema Commission report, the Judicial Committee constituted by the government to look at the how gender operates and how safety norms are instituted.
Interesting.
So for me, it was important for multiple reasons. So Rani Padmini, who was murdered by, and her mother, who was murdered by the driver, Vijayashree, and finally Silk Smitha. And Silk Smitha was a dancer who essentially started as an assistant to a makeup artist. And then she became a dancer, and she was very prominent dancer actress.
Hmm.
So what happened? So this is like a precursor to the item numbers that Bollywood will kind of insert the later point of time. And she was a dancer, and there are sequences of cabaret where Silk Smitha appears in a lot of films in South Indian languages, as well as like films dubbed in Hindi and Sinhala. So her dance numbers were seen as an integral part of the box office success of any film at that point of time. So 1980 to 86 was the time where her films were like succeeding one after the other. So Silk Smitha wanted to try production, and it didn't work out. There were other kind of issues that she was battling, and she committed suicide. So in all these three instances, the film journalistic discourse was around looking at the bodies of the corpses of each of these actresses as kind of with a forensic gaze. So all the obituary columns that you will see in film magazines were interested in the number of cuts in the body and the way in which the body was placed in the room, dimension of the room, what else was there. Rani Padmini and her mother's body was found after 5 to 6 days. By then, it started disintegrating, and it was folded on a palm mat. So even the
Yeah.
photo of a palm mat appeared in the film journals kind of coverage of news photographs. So there is something happening there which probably you will not see in the death reports of prominent actresses who are mainstream actors or actresses. And that's why it really struck me that there is something more happening, because their personal lives are right now opened and exposed for anyone to intervene in. And the kind of discretion that possibly might have been there in terms of rumors and gossips are all laid to rest when it comes to women who are cast as Madhaka Rani. It's as if they are being made as equivalent to sex workers, and that's the kind of rhetoric that has been in the film industry over a period of time, that actresses have to constantly protect themselves and their image. And it was even insisted that they should have like a male guardian who will be shepherding them, so that this idea of them being available sexually is not kind of allowed. So more women from middle class, upper caste backgrounds started to enter film industry. There was also certain respectability expected out of these women, and how that respectability will also tie with the respectability film industry was demanding as a legitimate form of business.
Yeah,
So
I think that it relates back to the fact that caste-based sexual violence in India, from even the colonial period, right, to
yeah,
cases like Hathras, Unnao,
right.
reveal how caste and desire intersect in violent ways, right? And do you think mainstream discussions about gender often erase caste from those conversations, or like, what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, so let me just go back to
Yeah,
the example, because that will be like a good example to showcase how mainstream film industry erases caste. Silk Smitha died, and then there was a film called Dirty Picture, which was made in 2011
yeah.
by Milind Luthria. So the film was seen as a biopic of Silk Smitha. That's how it was publicized. It was released on December 2nd, till Silk Smitha's family filed a defamation suit, saying that this is like sensational kind of news reports which doesn't have any factual claims, and you're interested in gossip. You've never done any research, right? Like for any film on a biopic, you really need to do research on the subject. And here the subject is dead. Here the subject is also seen as a dancer and seen as acting in sexualized roles. So they took liberty with it. And then, I remember that there was this kind of war of words between Silk Smitha's family and the director, and also the Vinu Chakravarti, who was the director who made the first film with Silk Smitha called Vandi Chakram, where she acted in the role of a sex worker. And he was the one who gave the name Smitha to her. Her real name is Vijay Lakshmi.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
he and Ekta Kapoor, the producer of Dirty Picture, they also had like this kind of a very aggressive kind of conversation, saying that you never did the research. And then Ekta Kapoor responding to, Chakravarti, saying that Silk Smitha is not yours. Silk Smitha is everyone. So ultimately what the film became, and if you see the film, you will know that the film ends with a shot of Vidya Balan, who enacts the role of Silk Smitha in her deathbed in that, saffron mark and red color sari and all of that, which Silk Smitha was never. Silk Smitha was very curt in her responses. She was one of those figures who, right from early on, understood that there were different hierarchies among actresses. Even when she was invited, to have food with others, she understood that she was not considered as an actress. She was only considered as a dancer. So
Yeah.
those kind of conversations also meant that the film journalistic reports had never anything good to say about her, because they were not interested in Silk Smitha or what she was trying to say. And Silk Smitha's cast was never discussed. when she was alive.
Yeah.
So then Dirty Picture came out. I think two important things I want to say here, which is like Jenny Ravenna wrote this amazing article in Roundtable India where she spoke about how Vidya Balan, an upper caste woman, enacting a fair-skinned upper caste woman, is enacting the role of a actress whose dusky skin was seen as the mark of the sexualized role and eroticized the role she performed. And the dark skin and the lower caste status, everything comes to discussion with Dirty Picture. Till then, no conversation on caste. But Dirty Picture doesn't make this anything about caste. It doesn't refer to caste at all. It only make it like, a kind of a Bollywood, a rags to riches story of, a junior artist wanting to become a lead actress. So it completely eliminated that. And the second problem with the film was also that it created a kind of a bogeyman in terms of like soft porn industry as contributing to the deterioration of Silk Smitha. Silk
Yeah.
Smitha was never a soft porn actress.
Yeah.
Silk Smitha acted in films which showcased her in the cast of Madhaka Rani as a sexually autonomous woman who was deeply interested in understanding her desires and moving out of the kind of marital conjugality, but that doesn't make her a soft porn actress. So that's where the question of caste becomes important.
Yeah.
Whose narrative can you co-opt? And finally,
Yeah.
it became like, co-optation by Bollywood of a regional film industry and the actress who came from there for box office success because they were not really interested in understanding the nexus of caste or class or the labor practices or anything